Hello all, welcome, and thank you so much for having me along. Thank you for that very kind introduction, Carolyn. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to come along to Lighter Footprints events. As Carolyn mentioned, I chair the Climate Action Network of Australia. That's an organisation that brings together environment groups, local community organisations like Lighter Footprints, unions, health sector organisations, faith groups, the Aid and Development Network, to come together and work strategically on climate change and to think about how we can work best together and actually make sure our impact is greater than the sum of our parts. Because we know the scale of the change we need is so enormous, all of society has a part to play, and we need to do that work together. And to be able to have in our network organisations like Lighter Footprints that create a really genuine connection to communities and feed that in strategically into those network conversations is incredibly important. And of all the different community climate action groups I have the pleasure to work with, Lighter Footprint has a very unique ability to turn out a crowd on a weeknight for an event like this. So well done to all of the volunteers who have made this happen. But you also have a really phenomenal way of engaging with the real depth of the issues that we are facing and bringing new people into those discussions. And tonight is a real testament to that skill and that network and being able to provide those opportunities for discussion to the community. So as I said, it is a real pleasure to be involved. Carolyn mentioned Slido before, and I do just want to point out how important that is to make the most of tonight's opportunity that you all have. You're about to hear from three of Australia's leading thinkers in this space, people who have been a part of absolutely changing the debate, domestically and internationally, and creating the infrastructure, the policy infrastructure that is so essential for this change to be possible. You're going to hear from each of those speakers tonight. They're going to come up and speak for about 15 minutes each, and I'll introduce them one at a time. And then we are going to take our seats here, and I have the pleasure of moderating a discussion amongst our panellists. But the themes that I choose will entirely be informed by all of you. So by going to Slido, by putting in your questions as you're thinking about issues that are arising or hearing from the speakers and wanting to know more, or if there are things that are not touched on that you think we really need to be addressing, make sure you're putting it in. Carolyn mentioned that I certainly won't get to all of the questions, but it will give me a flavour of what the audience is most interested in, and that will be able to guide where we go. As was mentioned, you can also vote on other people's questions. So again, we get a sense of where the enthusiasm and the interest really is. So please do go ahead. It's not a difficult app to use if you have any trepidation about that. So on to our speakers. Our first speaker for this evening is Tom Kompas, who is a Professor of Environmental Economics and Biosecurity in the School of Biosciences and the School of Ecosystem and Forest Sciences at the University of Melbourne. Tom is a member of the ANU Climate Change Institute and was formerly the Director of the Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU from 2009 to 2015. Tom works with all levels of government in Australia and internationally on biosecurity, energy, and the economics of climate change. His most recent issues paper for the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute was titled Australia's Clean Economy Future, Costs and Benefits. And when Tom's not leading research in environment economics, Tom likes to play on his 10 computers, which he has running in parallel at home at the same time. I don't know how many questions we're going to get through on Slido about that, but if that dominates the debate, you're not focused. Welcome, Tom. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much, Victoria. Yes, I am a geek, and proud to say so. Actually, more exactly, I'm an applied mathematician and an economist. That's normally a conversation stopper, especially on the weekends. But tonight I'm going to try and be a little bit more conversational. I've got a lot of detail and some graphics on the screen, some of which you might not be able to see that clearly, and that's okay. I just want to talk you through the issues. and try and focus on some of the particular measures and figures that are relevant for us. Everyone says that the cost of doing nothing, the cost of business as usual, will invoke tremendous damages, not only to Australia, but to the global economy. And they always say the cost of emissions reduction is much lower than that, but no one gives you precise figures. No one tells you exactly what the numbers are. And that's what we're able to do, and that's what I want to take you through, both for the globe and for Australia in particular. It's important to talk about the global picture because the distribution of the damages from climate change is very uneven, very heterogeneous. Some countries get pounded much more than others, and that's something that we should keep in mind and think about as we look at this sort of material and go forward. Right, first slide. So where are we now? Well, it's not good. We know that climate change is happening more rapidly than we thought it was. In particular, the effects of climate change are happening more rapidly. The science for predicting global temperature increases is pretty robust, but the effects are starting to be felt, and quite severely in some places. We know there are more destructive hurricanes, and we know that there are, every year, rather horrible fires on every continent except Antarctica. And those fires are quite damaging, generating sort of real concerns for livelihoods and also food security. We know that water supplies are shrinking, and some parts of the world are threatened by drought, and indeed by fire. California at the moment is burning. Australia, as you know, is in a drought in many parts of the country. The ocean is warming. Why? Because temperatures are increasing. We know that sea levels are increasing because the ice is melting. And indeed, when oceans warm, it affects fish populations, and quite dramatically. They either move or they suffer. And that's happening in particular all up and down the southeast coast of Australia, down to Tasmania. Fish populations are really struggling. So when sea level rises, of course, it threatens not only Pacific Island nations, but coastal nations, coastal properties, coastal cities everywhere. And indeed, it's not just Ho Chi Minh and Miami and Shanghai. It's everywhere. There's a particular concern at the moment going forward about the southeast coast of Victoria and what's going to happen in the next 20 or 30 years. So we know that's happening, and indeed it may be happening indeed again faster than we thought. We also know that there's record high temperatures in many parts of the world. Indeed, some parts of the world are basically unlivable. So we want to sort of tease out what the potential damages from this sort of set of events, these things that are happening, are going forward. See if we can put a real accurate, reasonably accurate dollar number on the kinds of damages that have been we're likely to incur. Economists have not been good at this. Economists have vastly underestimated the damages from climate change, starting with a very famous climate model by Nordhaus, for which he received the Nobel Prize. Tonight we're going to look at something that's a little more dimensionally large and a little more exact in terms of the kinds of damages we could expect, knowing that I haven't captured everything in particular. Next slide, please. So this is a big slide with a lot of words that you don't have to look at. But what we do is we form a very large dimensional global trade and climate model. 139 countries across 50 or 60 different commodity groups where you can consume and trade between countries, within a country, globally. All right? It includes agriculture, manufacturing, infrastructure, transport, all kinds of commodities that are produced, fossil fuels, renewables, all kinds of energy sources. And we track that system globally and how it's impacted by climate change in this global trading context. It's the largest dimensional model that you can get for the economics of climate change. Next slide, please. Attached to that, we use what are called damage functions. What's the effect of an increase in temperature on that global setting, in particular in those sectors, if we have business as usual or if we transition to a cleaner economy as we should. Now, for tonight, the damages in particular that we're going to look at are the loss in agricultural productivity, which is profound, particularly when there is fires and floods and heat waves, and also some sea level rise that affects land in particular. We're going to look at falls in labor productivity And we're going to look at, along with sea level rise in terms of inundation effects, generally speaking, human health effects. We want to add up these damages as we go forward with different kinds of assumptions about what's happening to global temperatures. We're not including infrastructure damage from sea level rise. I'll do that in the end when I talk about Australia. And we're not including a lot of the fire events so far that might be relevant. So when I give you dollar numbers for damages, keep in mind that's only a limited set of damages that are being estimated. Much better than what we've been doing so far, but it's still limited. Next slide, please. And here's the point. This is a graph you may have seen. But when you get small changes in global temperatures, even though it's only 1 or 2 degrees, you get a lot more variability in temperature extremes, in particular in hot temperature extremes. So when you move from 25 to 27 degrees on average, you can see you go from the black to the red zone. You get more variation in temperatures. You get higher temperatures and more variation in temperatures. This is standard in climate change modeling, typical. So you don't necessarily just have to focus on the average increase in temperature. You think about the extremes as well. And indeed, that'll be the case for the economics, because the economics generates extreme cases that are different in various parts of the world. So we have this global model, big, large dimensional global model. And we ask the question, what's the effect of a temperature profile going forward? Can we add up the damages? And we can. Slide, please. So we do 2 things. We add up the damages that might accrue long-term, say in about 80 years, and the damages that will accrue from now until 2100. One's the long-run damage, one's the cumulative damage. And you can see the numbers, here are the numbers. If you can't see them, it's okay. The numbers for the long-run damage are huge. They range from, at 2 degrees warming, from 5.6 trillion up to 23 trillion at 4 degrees warming. Everything on the screen, if you can see, it's in billions. So that's actually 23 trillion at 4 degrees. And it varies across countries, and I'll show you a nice graphic for that in a moment. Next slide. Here are the cumulative numbers. Now, they're massive. If you ask yourself, what's the cumulative damages from those things I listed, falls in agricultural and labor productivity, sea level rise in terms of inundation effects, some human health effects, what's the damages from that accrue globally? Well, it ranges at 2 degrees from 171 trillion, and these are big numbers, and I'll talk about what they mean in a second, from 171 trillion up to 604 trillion at 4 degrees. Massive, just massive. But how are they distributed? Next slide, please. This is a nice graphic, I think, that tells you that there's heterogeneity in the damages that accrue as a result of climate change. Now, the scale here is the fall percentage change in GDP. GDP is this measure, you probably know, it's this measure of national income. So if GDP is falling, it usually means a recession or worse. In fact, 2/4 of a fall in GDP, even of 1 or 2%, usually means a recession. So the scale here goes from 0 to minus 28%. Okay? It doesn't show very well on the screen, but I'll look at the numbers later for Australia. But Australia should be a little bit pink, but you can see where the reds are, where the massive changes in GDP are. They're in Africa, particularly Western Africa, all through South Asia, and Southeast Asia and South America. That's where it's really going to matter, really going to get clobbered. It's bad enough in Australia, as you'll see, even with this limited set of damage functions, but those countries will really suffer. What does it mean? Next slide, please. Right? What do these big numbers mean? What's 604 trillion? Well, what's a loss in GDP of 28% if you're in Africa? Well, it's massive. Right? At the moment, Great Britain's worried about a potential fall in GDP of 4% with Brexit. They're concerned that there's a major recession coming with a 4% loss. Globally, the average loss here ranges from, it can vary depending upon assumptions on economic growth, from 3 to 10%. But the real point, we'll talk about Australia in a minute, the real point is that some countries really, really suffer. And in fact, many in our own neighborhood. You can see Cambodia, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, India. These are all 15 to 20% falls in GDP. There's heterogeneity in the damages. and it matters tremendously. Normal economic models just take global averages, and they'll say, well, GDP will fall 3 or 4 or 5%, and well, that's bad, but let's go on. But the heterogeneity, in fact, matters, really matters. Philippines, 20%. Parts of Africa, well over 26% falls in GDP. Now, you can imagine what that means, right? The global financial crisis in 2009 was estimated to have a fall in GDP from about roughly 4 to 5%, and it was tragic for the world economy. Imagine individual cases where you have falls in 28% in GDP. The Great Depression in the 1930s had an average fall of 15% in global GDP. So you're talking major economic meltdown. It's catastrophic. For those countries in particular, Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, everyone in our neighborhood, it'd be hard to imagine how they could survive fiscally, right? Because you're getting tremendous falls in incomes and production as a result of climate change and temperature increases. At the same time, you're trying to fund expenditures for emergency response. You can just imagine what will happen to the number of climate refugees under that setting, under that situation. It'd be quite bad. Something to worry about. Next slide. Okay, Australia. This is the graph that the Department of Energy and Environment uses for emissions. And it's the blue line is basically what's happened recently. And you can see that emissions are rising. The scale here is up to 700, right, from 300 to 700. If you rescale it a bit, and it's done specifically to make things look flatter. If you punch again, next slide, you'll see same data, but the scale's a bit different. You'll see that the carbon price period, Rudd-Gillard period, in fact, the carbon price was working, emissions were falling. Since then, emissions have just increased. The emergency emissions reduction fund's not very effective, apparently, right, because emissions have still been rising. Next slide. You may also note that we've got a long way to go. There's a challenge. There's hope, but there's a big challenge here because the amount of renewables in total electricity demand is still relatively small, 7 or 8%, and that's what this graphic shows. The gray on the top is the percentage of renewables in electricity demand, still small. Long way to go. Making progress, but still a long way to go. Next slide. So, what are the damages? What are the costs? If we do business as usual in Australia, what are the damages? Again, I use the same sort of large dimensional global platform to add up all these, albeit limited damage functions, to determine what happens with business as usual. And in this context, unlike before, I include infrastructure damages, something we've been working on quite heavily here in Australia. And you can see out to 2050, the cumulative damages for infrastructure dominate. There's 611 billion. Sea level rise is going to be a real problem. Just from that alone, 611 billion. Falls in sort of productivity, about 151 billion. And if I extend that out to 2100, it's massive, right? Because temperature increases really pound productivity. Losses in biodiversity, about 246 billion. So the total to just to 2050 is about 1.2 trillion Australian. These are conservative estimates with limited damage functions, assuming business as usual. If I take that out to 2100, it goes well over $6 trillion. You want to avoid that. And this is Australia, which isn't as impacted as some of those other countries we just talked about. Next slide. Okay, what about emissions reduction? What I wanted to do is just take a very mild renewable target. Let's assume that we have a 70% share of renewables in end-use energy consumption in 2050. What's the cost of that with the rest of the world on a Paris target? We can do much better than 70%, but I took the mild case. In fact, it's the case with land use change and a little bit of carbon capture that's consistent with zero net in 2050. If you can do better than 70%, it makes life easier. But I took the 70% case. What's the cost of that? Next slide. Well, it's not very large. You can see the change in GDP because we'd be exporting less fossil fuels. It has a cost, $31.6 billion. The cost of energy transition to renewables, particularly in the transport sector where it's relatively expensive, and a lot of work needs to be done, is about $40 billion. Land use change and some NET, about $27 billion. The total cost is about 145 billion Australian dollars. The model runs in terms of US dollars, so don't be confused. I've converted to Australian. So you get 1.2 trillion in damages compared to 145 billion in the cost of emissions reduction. That's where the 8-to-1 comes from that Carolyn mentioned. And that's with limited damage functions. You take that out again to 2100, and the cost-benefit ratio, the benefit-cost ratio, goes well over 50 to 1. It's huge. For Victoria, the ratio is about 1 to 4. For Queensland, it's much higher. Queensland's on the front line when it comes to climate change. Next slide. So, I'll close on this one. You know, all the modeling we've done over the last decade or so, any model we look at, even the very sophisticated large dimensional models, show that the cost of emissions reduction is always far less than the damages with business as usual. What's nice about this is we can actually put numbers on them. We can say something specific. We could go into Treasury and say there's an 8-to-1 trade-off. What's wrong? Let's go. Right? If Australia is not part of the solution, it's part of the problem. Right? And indeed, the longer we wait, this is standard in economics, the longer we wait, the more expensive it will become to reduce emissions, the more the damages will be incurred. We've got to start acting, well, years ago, but certainly now. Have to act now to get this under control. Last slide. It's the thank you. Thank you very much. The slide will also have some links on the online version. Cheers. Thank you.